Most people spend Memorial Day grilling in the backyard, visiting cemeteries, or spending time with family. But on the morning of May 26, 2026, while America was still asleep, the President of the United States was already on his phone, furious, firing, and pulling no punches. By 6 a.m., Donald Trump had already launched a full-scale social media assault on his political enemies, dropped cryptic warnings about Iran, and done all of this on a day specifically set aside to honor the men and women who died for this country. And that wasn't even the most shocking part of his weekend. This wasn't just a holiday weekend. This was a window into exactly where Donald Trump's mind is, and what's really going on behind the walls of 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. Before most of America had poured their first cup of coffee, Trump was already typing. The first post hit Truth Social at exactly 6 a.m. ET, and it came out swinging. He called out Democrats, spelling it Democrats, his favorite dig, along with rhinos and what he described as fools who know nothing. But this wasn't just a general attack. Trump went after specific people, by name, with surgical precision. First up was Senator Thom Tillis, who Trump declared would be soon out of office. Then came Bill Cassidy, who Trump noted had just suffered what he called a massive primary loss. And then there was Congressman Thomas Massie, and Trump did not hold back on Massie. He called him a major sleazebag who lost in a landslide after showing what Trump described as tremendous disloyalty to his party and his country. Now, the fact that Trump went this hard, this early on Memorial Day of all days, raised eyebrows immediately. These weren't throwaway insults either. Each name was chosen deliberately. Tillis had been one of the more vocal Republican critics of Trump's foreign policy moves. Cassidy had voted to convict Trump during his second impeachment trial, a move Trump never forgot and clearly never forgave. And Massie had been a persistent thorn in the side of Trump's congressional agenda for years. That line, dropped casually inside a rant about political losers, was actually one of the most loaded statements he'd made in weeks. And we'll get back to Iran because it plays a much bigger role in this story than just one social media post. But first, just 18 minutes later, Trump posted again. And this time he finally acknowledged what day it actually was. At 6:18 a.m., Trump sent his Memorial Day message to the nation. And yes, he did say Happy Memorial Day. He did write, God bless those that have made the ultimate sacrifice. He did say, I love you all. But in true Trump fashion, he couldn't resist threading a political attack right through the middle of it. The reaction online was immediate and divided, which, at this point, is basically the expected response to anything Trump does. Supporters argued he was simply speaking truth, that Democrats have a long history of undermining military funding and morale. Critics called it tone-deaf, disrespectful, and deeply inappropriate for the occasion. But honestly, for anyone who has followed Trump's social media behavior over the years, this wasn't surprising. What was surprising was what came just minutes later, a third post, short, punchy, and almost comedic in its delivery. Just before 6:30 a.m., Trump posted, "The Democrats have bad policy and bad candidates. Other than that, they are doing quite well." 3 posts. 30 minutes. A holiday morning. And Trump was just getting started. But while the social media world was buzzing about his posts, there was a far more serious reason why Trump was even at the White House in the first place that weekend. Because the original plan had been very different, and what changed those plans was something nobody saw coming. Let's step back for a moment, because the Iran angle in Trump's morning post was not random. It was deliberate, and it was a message. For weeks leading up to Memorial Day weekend, reports had been circulating about back-channel negotiations between U.S. representatives and Iranian officials. The details were murky, deliberately so, according to sources familiar with the talks. But the broad strokes suggested that Trump was pushing for a new kind of nuclear framework, one that would be structured completely differently from the 2015 JCPOA that he pulled the U.S. out of back in 2018. Trump's frustration, made clear in his Memorial Day post, was directed at politicians and commentators who were already criticizing a deal that, by his own admission, hadn't even been fully negotiated yet. In his view, the critics were jumping the gun, talking about something they had no real information about, just to score political points. And to be fair, that's not an entirely unreasonable complaint. Washington has a long history of leaking and pre-criticizing negotiations before they're finished, which can genuinely damage the diplomatic process. Trump's argument was essentially, let me work and judge the result, not the rumors. But here's where it gets complicated. The people Trump named in his post, Tillis, Cassidy, Massey, weren't just random critics. They were Republicans.
His own party.
The fact that the resistance to his Iran approach was coming from within GOP ranks suggested the deal being shaped was unusual enough to make even his allies nervous. What we do know is this: Iran was clearly weighing on him that weekend, and it played directly into the decision that upended his entire holiday schedule, a decision that started with a gunshot outside the White House. On Saturday, May 23rd, just 2 days before Memorial Day, something happened outside the White House that immediately changed everything. A man opened fire near the White House perimeter. Secret Service agents responded within seconds. The man was shot and killed. No one else was reported injured. The details that emerged in the hours and days following were limited, as they often are in situations involving active Secret Service responses. The identity of the shooter, his motive, and exactly what unfolded in those moments were being kept close to the chest by federal authorities as investigations continued. Trump had been planning to spend the Memorial Day weekend at his golf club in Bedminster, New Jersey, a familiar retreat that he's visited dozens of times during his presidency. That plan was scrapped. Trump stayed at the White House. And because Trump stayed at the White House, he did not get on a plane to the Bahamas, which meant he missed something that, under any other circumstances, would have been one of the most important family moments of the year: his son's wedding. Now, to understand just how significant that decision was and how complicated the story around it became, you need to know a little bit about what was happening in Nassau that weekend and who Donald Trump Jr. The man was shot and killed. No one else was reported injured. The details that emerged in the hours and days following were limited, as they often are in situations involving active Secret Service responses. The identity of the shooter, his motive, and exactly what unfolded in those moments were being kept close to the chest by federal authorities as investigations continued. Trump had been planning to spend the Memorial Day weekend at his golf club in Bedminster, New Jersey, a familiar retreat that he's visited dozens of times during his presidency. That plan was scrapped. Trump stayed at the White House. And because Trump stayed at the White House, he did not get on a plane to the Bahamas, which meant he missed something that, under any other circumstances, would have been one of the most important family moments of the year: his son's wedding. Now, to understand just how significant that decision was and how complicated the story around it became, you need to know a little bit about what was happening in Nassau that weekend and who Donald Trump Jr. The man was shot and killed. No one else was reported injured. The details that emerged in the hours and days following were limited, as they often are in situations involving active Secret Service responses. The identity of the shooter, his motive, and exactly what unfolded in those moments were being kept close to the chest by federal authorities as investigations continued. Trump had been planning to spend the Memorial Day weekend at his golf club in Bedminster, New Jersey, a familiar retreat that he's visited dozens of times during his presidency. That plan was scrapped. Trump stayed at the White House. And because Trump stayed at the White House, he did not get on a plane to the Bahamas, which meant he missed something that, under any other circumstances, would have been one of the most important family moments of the year: his son's wedding. Now, to understand just how significant that decision was and how complicated the story around it became, you need to know a little bit about what was happening in Nassau that weekend and who Donald Trump Jr. The man was shot and killed. No one else was reported injured. The details that emerged in the hours and days following were limited, as they often are in situations involving active Secret Service responses. The identity of the shooter, his motive, and exactly what unfolded in those moments were being kept close to the chest by federal authorities as investigations continued. Trump had been planning to spend the Memorial Day weekend at his golf club in Bedminster, New Jersey, a familiar retreat that he's visited dozens of times during his presidency. That plan was scrapped. Trump stayed at the White House. And because Trump stayed at the White House, he did not get on a plane to the Bahamas, which meant he missed something that, under any other circumstances, would have been one of the most important family moments of the year: his son's wedding. Now, to understand just how significant that decision was and how complicated the story around it became, you need to know a little bit about what was happening in Nassau that weekend and who Donald Trump Jr. was marrying. On Saturday, May 24th, Donald Trump Jr. married Bettina Anderson in a ceremony held in the Bahamas. Except the father of the groom wasn't there. Trump had actually hinted at the possibility of skipping the wedding days earlier in a conversation with reporters that quickly went viral. His words were blunt, almost brutally honest. He told reporters he had warned Don Jr. directly, "This is not good timing for me. I have a thing called Iran and other things." And then came the line that stopped everyone cold. "That's when I can't win on. If I do attend, I get killed. If I don't attend, I get killed," by the fake news, of course. The official announcement came on Truth Social. Trump wrote that while he very much wanted to be with Don Jr. and Bettina, circumstances pertaining to government and my love for the United States of America did not allow him to attend. He called it a matter of duty. He congratulated the couple. He signed it, as he always does, with his full name and title. "Congratulations to Don and Bettina. President Donald J. Trump." Public reaction was, predictably, all over the map. Some praised him for putting country first. Others found it cold, a father publicly prioritizing politics over his child's wedding day. Late-night hosts and political commentators had a field day. The irony of Trump staying home to deal with Iran only to spend the morning tweeting about Democrats was not lost on anyone. But before we go any further, who exactly is Bettina Anderson? Because the newest member of the Trump family is a fascinating figure in her own right, and not nearly enough people know her story. Bettina Anderson is not a political figure. She's not a reality TV personality. She didn't come from the orbit of Mar-a-Lago or the halls of the Trump Organization. And that, arguably, is what makes her one of the more interesting people to enter the Trump family circle in years. Her relationship with Don Jr. developed over time, and by the time their engagement became public knowledge, those close to the family described her as someone who had genuinely won over the Trump inner circle. No small feat, given how tight-knit and protective that group tends to be. What's particularly notable is the contrast between Bettina and Don Jr.'s previous high-profile relationship with Kimberly Guilfoyle, the former Fox News host who was famously a fixture on the MAGA campaign trail. Guilfoyle was loud, visible, and deeply embedded in Trump's political world. Anderson, by comparison, has kept a far lower profile. Whether that changes now that she's officially part of the Trump family remains to be seen. The Bahamas wedding itself was held without the president, but by all accounts, it went ahead beautifully. Don Jr. reportedly took the news of his father's absence in stride, or at least, that's the picture the family has presented publicly. What was said in private is, of course, a different story entirely. And that contrast between the polished public image and the messiness underneath is actually the perfect lens through which to look at this entire weekend. A shooting outside the White House. A son's wedding attended without his father. A president spending a national holiday of remembrance firing political attacks from his phone at 6 in the morning. And lurking behind all of it, the shadow of a nuclear negotiation with one of America's longest-standing adversaries. This is not a normal political moment. This is something else. Trump's Memorial Day social media behavior fits a pattern that his critics have long pointed to and his supporters have long defended. For his critics, the early morning rant on a day meant for solemn reflection is emblematic of a presidency that has consistently prioritized grievance over grace. For his supporters, it's proof that Trump never stops fighting, that even on holidays, he's thinking about the enemies he believes are working against America's interests. The names he targeted, Tillis, Cassidy, Massey, aren't random. They represent a specific faction of the Republican Party that has been willing, at various points, to break from Trump's agenda. By calling them out on Memorial Day, in front of his entire social media following, Trump was sending a message to every other Republican watching. Loyalty is not optional, and disloyalty has consequences, even years later. Bill Cassidy's primary loss and Tom Tillis's impending political sunset were held up not as cautionary tales, but as trophies. Evidence that crossing Trump comes with a price. Memorial Day, for most Americans, is about pausing, about remembering, about stepping away from the noise. For Trump, it was just another day at war. So here's where we land. A president who woke up before sunrise on a national holiday and chose to spend those first quiet hours attacking his political enemies by name. A nuclear negotiation casting a shadow over everything, including a family wedding that happened without the most powerful man in the world. A shooting outside the White House that reminded everyone, regardless of political affiliation, that the stakes of this moment in history are very, very real. What this weekend revealed about Donald Trump isn't particularly new, but it is a sharper, clearer version of what we already knew. He doesn't separate the personal from the political. He doesn't distinguish between a Monday in February and Memorial Day in May. Every day is a campaign. Every moment is a battlefield. Every critic is a target. Whether you see that as strength or as something more troubling depends entirely on where you stand. But what you can't argue is that it's consistent. Relentlessly, exhaustingly, fascinatingly consistent. Don Jr. got married in the Bahamas without his father. A man lost his life outside the White House. Iran negotiations hang in the balance. And Trump spent the morning telling the world that the Democrats have bad policy and bad candidates, but other than that, they're doing quite well. Only in this presidency. Only with this man. And if history has shown us anything, it's that the next weekend will be just as unpredictable as this one.